Okay, this is the second video for today. We're gonna solve 7 through 10. We continue with trig equations. As you guys can see for the first example, which is number 7, we said the golden rule is to always factor equal to 0 and solve. So you can notice that there's no square in it. So a good way to factor will be just to look for a common factor. So if I look here, I can see the sign is repeating. So I factor out the sign. I have secant left minus a 3. I know some of you have asked me, like, where did the x go? Just for the sake of simplifying how I write it, I sometimes skip the x, but of course it's there. So sine x equals 0. By now, everyone should know that 0 and pi, those are the two angles that have sine equals 0. And we go back to the circle. 0 and pi both have a y coordinate of 0. And secant equals a 3, so the cosine, which is the reciprocal of secant, is 1/3. When you see that the value is not remarkable, it's not something you know on the unit circle, that means you need to use the calculator. So inverse cosine and you get 1.23. That's in radian. You can, of course, convert it to a degree. Number 8, cosine of 3x equals 0. I know this is a little tricky, threw some of you off. That 3, ignore it. Just put a t if you want. Cosine t equals 0. Which angle t has a cosine equals 0? Or u, I used u here. The pi over 2 and the 3 pi over 2. So those two have a cosine equals 0. But this is not u, it is 3x. So I substitute it with 3x equals pi over 2. Now all what I have to do to solve for x is to divide by 3 on both sides. So divide by 3, divide by 3. When I divide pi over 2 divided by 3, as if I'm multiplying by 1/3, which makes a pi over 6. Similarly, the other solution, u is a 3 pi over 2, but u is 3x. So I divide by 3, divide by 3, the 3's cancel out, and you're left with pi over 2. So the solutions aren't pi over 2 and 3 pi over 2, but they are pi over 6 and pi over 2. The same thing here. Cosine of 2x equals -1 over square root of 2. And I'm trying to look right here. Yeah, I'm sorry, I missed that one. Yeah, rationalize it first. Now it looks familiar. Ignore the 2 next to the x and just take all this, substitute it with u. The two angles that have a negative square root of 2 over 2 as a cosine are 3 pi over 4 and 5 pi over 4. We can look at that. So this is cosine 3 pi over 4. And again, this is cosine 5 pi over 4 has a cosine negative square root of 2 over 2. 3 pi over 4 has a cosine negative square root of 2 over 2. So again, 3 pi over 4, 5 pi over 4. But this is not going back from u to x. I need to solve for x, not u. So divide by 2, divide by 2. So 3 pi over 8. Dividing by 2, same thing as multiplying by half. So 5 pi over 8, 3 pi over 8. Okay? That's if you were solving in the whole circle. Now, the b becomes a little bit tricky when it says from negative pi to pi, which simply means count. As you guys see, what's the negative pi? If you go backward, if you remember when we did the negative radian, when you say negative pi, you're going this way, and here's negative pi. And when you say pi, you're going that way. And this is pi, okay? So basically, you're just counting backward or in the negative radian, so you get the same thing, but negative, and divide by 2. The first one, number 10, the first part of number 10, substitute and solve it using the x method. You get a cosine equals 2. That's not acceptable. Cosine has to be between -1 and 1. And the second one, you get a negative pi. And this is acceptable. Let's say you had a pi. Let's say you had cosine x equals 1. I just gave this as an example. If you got cosine x equals 1 and the answer was pi, I cannot take that answer because it's not included in the interval. I was just explaining this part is if you have cosine x equals 1 and x equals pi. I'm sorry, if you had cosine x equals -1 and you can get pi or negative pi is acceptable. X equals pi is not acceptable because it's not included in the given interval. And there is no solution is -pi/2 pi/2, because if you guys remember, this is -pi/2. Let me just try to get the cursor. From 0, this is -pi/2, and this is pi/2. So we're solving right here, and the cosine cannot equal -1 right here. That's why it's no solution in that interval. So all solution depends on the interval. Okay, and I hope this helps.